Thank you so very much, Ellen. Okay, so the first thing I have to do is make sure everyone can hear me. Can you hear me? No. We're on. Is that better? Okay, I'll try to keep it closer. If at any point, this is a talk on hearing, if at any point you cannot hear me, please, wave your hand or just shout at me. I want to make sure that there's enough amplification in the room. I want to thank you so much for having me today. It's such a pleasure to be here. Thank you so much to Ellen for the very kind invitation. So as Ellen mentioned, I'm a PhD trained epidemiologist. Epidemiology is the science of public health. I came to Baltimore from the Midwest in 2005, and I came for a master's degree in epidemiology. I was actually trained in biology. I was working with fruit flies. So I don't know if you've ever done the Drosophila or the fruit flies in labs in school. That's what I had been doing. And I decided at that time, what I really wanted to do was some science work that would actually make a difference for a person. So I left the flies behind. I came to Baltimore to Johns Hopkins to get a master's in epidemiology. And I was very, very fortunate because I was able to train with Dr. Leon Gordis, who is really one of the most amazing epidemiologists I think who has ever lived, and has really, kind of revolutionized, I think, the teaching of epidemiology. And he was a tremendous influence. I learned so much from him that I decided I wanted to stay for the PhD. My focus was always in dementia. So my father's mother had Parkinsonian dementia. And then my mother's mother and her father, unfortunately, both had Alzheimer's disease, and that's how they passed away. And so that's really where I wanted to focus my work. And around the time I was finishing up my PhD, there was a lot we were learning about risk and what we could do to prevent dementia, but it was all about what we could do in midlife. So let's, make sure our hypertension is controlled, make sure we're taking diabetes medication, smoking cessation, that sort of thing. But it was all about, in your 40s and 50s. And we have a lot of people in our country who are older than that. And it was very unsatisfying to think, we need to tell you, you should have taken better care of your health when you were, in midlife, right? And so around that time, there was some information starting to come out to think about hearing loss. And hearing loss is something that predominantly impacts us in older age. And so that's really how I started working on this. I was thinking, this is something that we can maybe actually do something about when we're older that could potentially reduce cognitive decline and dementia. So I've been at Hopkins ever since. I joined the faculty after completing my PhD. And I work very closely with Dr. Frank Lin, who is a key leader on a lot of this work. If you've read any stories about hearing in the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal, you've probably seen his name. He is the director of the Cochlear Center for Hearing and Public Health, and that's where I am core faculty. And I also am really heavily involved in our teaching mission. So I teach epidemiology to all of our new students coming into the School of Public Health. And I'm responsible for the doctoral program in epidemiology, as well as the training program at the Cochlear Center. So that's really where I'm focused, research on this and education of those who are coming. I just want to let you know, I do have National Institute of Health funding, but I don't have any other disclosures. So what I'm saying to you here today is my honest opinion. There's no ulterior motive. So I am an epidemiologist. I think before the pandemic, we had to actually explain what that was. A lot of times people thought we were skin doctors or things like that. But we actually study public health, and epidemiology is the science of public health. We're the ones who do the studies. When you see in the news, hearing aids prevent dementia, that's some of the work that we're doing that you would see in those headlines. This is a cartoon that's from, I think it's the New Yorker, but here was a black tie affair, and the caption reads, and it was so typically brilliant of you to have invited an epidemiologist. So thank you again, Ellen, for the invitation today. So I want to start with just a little bit of background and a little bit of thinking about why this is important. So let's consider someone, and here we'll just call him John Smith, a patient who's 12 years old. Here, what I'm showing is what we call an audiogram. It's the way that we kind of measure hearing in an individual. On the left side, we have the intensity or how loud or soft a sound is. Very soft sounds are going to be at the top. Very loud sounds are going to be at the bottom. Going across the top, we have the different frequencies or pitches. So this is how low something sounds, which is all the way on the left, to something that sounds very high pitched, which would be on the right. And then what we do is find the threshold, which is the lowest threshold that someone can hear a sound. And it's just a tone, it's not speech. And many of you may have had your hearing tested. You may have gone into a booth. Oftentimes your back may be, or your turn so that you can't see the person who's administering the task. You have earphones in or headphones on, and they just ask you to raise your hand or maybe to hit a clicker when you hear the tone. And so what they do is they map that out for each ear. And so what's shown here really is just a very mild hearing loss in both ears. And that means that everything that's in the yellow box that's shown up above shows that if you had good or perfect hearing, you would be kind of measuring, your thresholds would be in that range. But here you can see they're just a little bit below, which means it's just really a mild loss. If this hearing loss were identified in someone who's 12 years old, it would be immediately treated. And that's because we have a lot of really good research showing that hearing is important for kids. It's important for their speech understanding. It's important for how well they do in school, and then how well they progress in later life. But I can tell you, if we had the same John Smith, who's now instead 72 years old instead of 12, this hearing loss would really be considered normal, and probably not much would be done about it. And that's really what the mission at the Cochlear Center is. We're trying to understand, when do we need to treat? When is hearing loss important? Is this mild loss okay, or does it actually lead to other things like cognitive decline? And unfortunately, hearing has been something that's just been considered to be something normal that happens with aging. And so it really has been ignored for a long time, but we don't think it should be. We think it has important consequences. So I just want to show you a little bit. Hearing loss is very common, and it increases as we age. So this is data from a study that our group did, and it uses nationally representative data. So it's from all over the United States. The prevalence is on the y-axis, which is the proportion of people out of everybody who has hearing loss. And at the very bottom, it runs from 0 all the way up to 80% at the very top. And then you can see all the way on the left, we're starting with the youngest age bin, which is 12 to 19 years old. And then with each increasing kind of bin, we're getting into another 10-year age category. So 20 to 29, 30 to 39, all the way up to those who are greater than 80 years old. And it is very dramatic. I don't have to point out the trend to you. We see how many more people are impacted by hearing loss as we age. And what that really means is by the time that we get to be 70 years old, it's 2 out of 3 have a clinically significant hearing loss. And by that, I mean it is hearing loss that is significant enough to impact your everyday communication, your everyday quality of life. So it really does impact a large proportion of people. I want to talk just a little bit about how we hear, because how we hear is important for us to understand in order to know why it might have impacts on other aspects of our life. So sound, just starting with sound, and not even necessarily speech. Speech is very complex sound, but of course there are many other sounds. Sound is a wave. It's a series of pressure waves. It's a vibrating object that causes that, and it propagates through what we call an elastic medium, whether that be through the air or something else. You know the old adage, of course, if a tree falls in the woods. And what that really means is that is sound. But sound is different than audibility or our ability to hear that sound, right? So we have to have some sort of organ, in this case, it's our inner ear, that allows us to be able to hear that. But even if we can actually hear that sound, that's actually different than hearing. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that. And then even hearing beyond that is not listening. We have to be paying attention. We have to be using our brain in order to be listening. So I really want to make this distinction. Sound is not audibility. Audibility is different than hearing. And if we're listening, that's even different than hearing itself. But of course, listening is so important for so many aspects of our life. So we have a sound wave, then it goes to the ear. This is the auditory system. We start with the outer ear, which is your earlobe is called the pinna. Sound goes in through the ear canal. It travels along through the ear canal. If you have wax or if you have an infection and some fluid in your ear, that can impact your hearing in a short-term kind of way. But it has to get then through the ear canal to the tympanic membrane or the eardrum. You probably remember from elementary school now, hammer, anvil, and stirrup, those 3 ears, or those 3 bones in the middle ear that vibrate with that sound. And then really where we hear, where that audibility occurs is in an organ that's called the cochlea. And that's that spiral shaped organ all the way in the middle ear. And our cochlea really is the organ for hearing. So what happens is that pressure, that sound, that's mechanical energy, comes in. When it goes through the cochlea, it gets transduced or encoded into now an electrical signal or a neural signal that then is sent to the brain. So we really can think about hearing occurring in 2 steps. This is the first step. It happens in the ear, where the sound wave is encoded into an electrical signal or into a neural signal. But then it has to go to the brain to be decoded. And an entire part of our brain in our temporal lobe is devoted to be able to process sensory, including sound. And so that's really where this second step happens. So we have a signal that is encoded in the inner ear. It goes to the brain where it's decoded, and then we actually are able to do something with that sound. When we think about hearing loss, so our inability now to hear with as much fidelity as we were able to before, I want to just emphasize that it's not about volume. And if any of you have a loved one or a friend who has hearing loss, you may know that shouting doesn't help, right? It's low and slow, and that really is what helps. And it's because it's not about volume, it's about clarity. And so here I have another example of the audiogram. It's slightly different because now I'm giving you some contextual clues for where certain sounds are that you might hear. So for example, if we go all the way up in the upper right-hand corner, this is where we have soft sounds that are very high pitched. So we have things like leaves rustling or birds chirping. If we go all the way then to the bottom left, that's where we have very low sounds, very loud sounds. So like think of a diesel engine. That would be where that would be, those kinds of sounds would be localized here on the audiogram. You can see there's a very interesting, it's in kind of green or yellow. This is actually called the speech banana. Or if you're in Australia, they call it the speech boomerang, but clearly the shape. And the reason this is there is because that's really where most of the sounds are that are important for us to hear in order to be able to understand speech. So if we can't hear those sounds, that's when we get into trouble. We're not able to hear speech around us. I'm overlaying now a line that looks like a typical age-related hearing loss. We have a fancy word for this. We call it presbycusis. And this is a typical shape that you'll see when you graph someone's hearing on an audiogram. And it happens to all of us as we age, and it's based on biology. And that's because the hair cells that are so important for transducing or encoding that signal in the inner ear, unfortunately, over time, we lose those hair cells, they die, and they don't regenerate. There are people trying to figure out stem cell research and that sort of thing on how we could regenerate. But at this point, we don't know how to do that. So over time, as we lose those hair cells, this is the pattern and the shape that we see in terms of hearing loss. But what that means is that everything above that line, we now can no longer hear unless we're in an aided condition. So remember when we talked about sound, Speech is very complex sound. No matter what it is, it's complex. And here's just an example. This is from a colleague of mine, Dr. Nicholas Reed. He's an audiologist. We work together at the center. And this is an example he likes to use. So an example of something that seems simple, actually quite complex. The sentence is, you should go to the pharmacy before you go to your house. So we have those sound waves that then have to go through that process in the inner ear where they get encoded into sound, decoded in the brain. But if we have loss of hair cells as we age, if we're not able to encode that sound into a very crisp, clear signal, it's garbled. So it's a garbled signal that goes to the brain. And that means the brain has to really think about what it's hearing. And we actually have a term for that. We call it cognitive load, and we'll come back to that a little bit later. But it means that we're missing parts of speech. And that's why when you actually talk to someone who has hearing loss, they may say something like, speak up, it sounds like you're mumbling, right? They can hear part of what you're saying, they just can't hear all of it. So as an example for someone who might have a mild or moderate hearing loss, instead of hearing, you should go to the pharmacy before you go to your house, they might hear this instead. You would go to Arma-E before you get to your out. I had to practice really hard to be able to say that, right? But you can see there are parts that are missing. And that means your brain has to work that much harder to understand exactly what was said. So it's clarity, it's not just volume. Okay, we've talked already a lot about how we measure hearing. For those of you who have had an audiometric test, this really is the gold clinical standard. Most of the time it will be within a soundproof booth, but we actually now have tablets where we can just go out into someone's home, for example, and we do this in many of our research studies. And we can actually just use the tablet in an open air environment. We're able to monitor for noise and make sure that we can get valid testing. But exactly as I've shown on that audiogram, the goal is across a range of those pitches, so from low to high, we want to understand the very softest sounds you can hear. So audiometry is the gold clinical standard for measuring hearing loss. It determines the faintest tones that a person can detect across this range of frequencies or pitches. If you are to go to a booth, oftentimes there may be over-the-ear headphones, kind of as pictured here with the woman. Sometimes they may have insert earphones, kind of more like you would get with your iPhone or iPad, something like that. And then here again, I'm just showing the audiogram and the speech banana. And again, we just kind of understand how quiet can a sound be for you to be able to hear across these various pitches. So that's really how we'll measure hearing if you come into the clinic. Again, when we think about hearing loss, highlighting just how common it is, 2/3 out of every adult over the age of 70. This gets more prevalent as we age. It does usually occur because of those biological changes that are occurring in the inner ears, so the loss of those hair cells. The thing I think that's tricky about hearing loss is that it actually is quite gradual. So I am losing my hearing. I have now not as good hearing as I used to when I was younger. I don't know if you remember, it was, maybe 10 years ago, it was kind of all the rage. They had different phones that had different pitches that you could play, and your mom couldn't hear it, but you could hear that your friend was messaging you. I can't hear those tones anymore. 10 years I could, right? So as we age, our hearing is always kind of changing. So it really is gradual, and we may not even notice that it's happening unless we're really paying attention to our hearing, whether we're getting our hearing tested frequently, right? And then most importantly, as we lose hearing ability, then it can be more difficult for us to understand speech. And that's really why hearing loss is so important, because we no longer have access to speech, communication with others in the same way that we did. Okay. So what I really do, and I mentioned, my interest has always been in thinking about cognition and dementia, and what can we do from a public health perspective to help delay cognitive decline from occurring, to help prevent dementia from occurring. So I've mentioned that hearing loss is really common, but why would it be associated with our cognition? I will say, so there have been some really prestigious scientific bodies that have actually tried to understand and summarize everything that's been published out there in the literature. The Lancet is a prestigious British medical journal, and in 2017, they really tried to understand, based on everything that's been published so far, how much of dementia can we prevent? What proportion of dementia is preventable because it's risk factors that we can do something about, compared to what is something that it's just biology, we don't know that we can change it, it's genetics and things like that. This is the figure that they published, and this is actually from an update, so they updated in July of 2020. But they tried to look across the life course. So education is something that is really important for maintaining your cognitive health as we age. So that's something that happens in early childhood. But then we have a number of other factors across the life course. And what they actually estimated was that about 40% of dementia that occurs in the world, about 40% of those cases we might be able to prevent, because they're probably due to risk factors that are modifiable, things we can change. I think what was really surprising to the dementia community, the research community, was in 2017 when they published this, it was the first time that hearing loss really showed up as an important risk factor. And it's not just that it was an important risk factor, it was the most important risk factor. So they estimated that overall, about 8% of dementia cases in the world might be due to hearing loss. And what that means is if we are able to treat hearing loss successfully, or if we're able to delay hearing loss from occurring, we might be able to prevent dementia or delay dementia, right? So a very, very important risk factor. And it's more important than a lot of other things that we know are important too, right? Like maintaining good blood pressure, making sure we're socially engaged and active, making sure that we're watching our weight, eating a good diet, right? All those things we know are important for our brain as well. And hearing loss was more important than any of those. So why might we see this relationship? So here's the question. And the first thing that we always have to acknowledge, so in public health studies, we have a really strong study design that we call a randomized trial. And that really gives us the strongest level of evidence. So if we conduct a randomized trial and we see that hearing treatment prevents dementia, then we have a really good idea that actually hearing loss is causing dementia, treating hearing loss prevents it, right? But we can't do clinical trials for a lot of things. And actually we have a clinical trial ongoing, we just don't have the results yet. So what we're left with is something that we call observational studies. And this is where we just observe what happens with people in the real world. And when we have that type of study, they can be very powerful and tell us a lot of good information, but sometimes they can be wrong. And there is bias that can occur in these studies. And I think as epidemiologists, we don't do a very good job about communicating risk and how certain we are about our study findings. One type of bias that we might have is something that we call a common cause. And that would be something else that's happening with aging is leading both to hearing loss and to change in our thinking abilities. So for example, and there are some researchers that believe that it's actually changes in the brain. So as we get older and we start to lose parts of our brain atrophy over time, that maybe that neurodegeneration is leading both to changes in hearing as well as to increased risk of dementia. And that may be, we don't know. If it is, it means that treating hearing won't do anything to prevent dementia, right? So I do just have to say up front that there are some pathways like this common cause that might explain those associations that the Lancet Commission found. So we need to be clear about that. But we also think there are some pathways that hearing loss may actually cause dementia and changes to our thinking abilities. And the first one I mentioned already, and this is called cognitive load. And this is the mental effort that's required for recognizing or understanding speech and sounds and language. So again, going back to this idea that we start with sound, it's processed, it's encoded in the inner ear, it's then sent to the brain for decoding. If we have trouble with encoding that sound in our inner ear, then we don't understand exactly what's being said when it goes to our brain. So again, it's that example of you should go to the pharmacy before you go to your house. And we know if your brain is trying really hard to understand what was said, you don't remember things as well. And there have been a lot of studies that have been done that have shown this. They've taken young people with very good hearing, they've degraded the auditory signal, and then they've given a memory task to try to understand how much they remember. And you don't remember as much because your brain is distracted. You're trying to figure out what's being said instead of doing things like forming memories based on what you heard. So that's cognitive load. Another really important potential mechanism is increases to social isolation and loneliness. And so as we may lose our hearing over time, remember it may be a gradual process. It may start out with just having difficulty hearing in noise. And that can be frustrating. Maybe it means that we start to withdraw a little bit, or you can imagine we might choose not to go out as often. Perhaps we used to meet friends once a month at a noisy restaurant. Now it's frustrating for us to go because we can't hear and participate in the conversation. Maybe we start to withdraw from those activities over time. So loneliness and isolation are two very important factors that can then happen if we start to disengage. And again, it may be so gradual, we may not even be making conscious decisions to do it, right? We may just be putting ourselves in situations where we're not quite as frustrated. This is a report. What's being shown here on the right is from the National Academies for Science, Engineering, and Medicine. Social isolation and loneliness are really understood at this time to be very, very important for health. I think we were just starting to learn how important they were before the pandemic hit, and then the pandemic hit, and we really started to understand as the field of public health just how important these were. When we think about isolation and loneliness, they're actually different ideas, but they're related. So isolation is the number of connections that you have. It's the quality of those connections. So maybe if I'm asked how many people can I turn to for help, that's an example of social connectedness, and then the opposite would be isolation if I don't have very many connections. That's different from loneliness. Loneliness is how I feel about those connections. And loneliness, actually, there's more people in the world who are lonely compared to those who don't have very many social connections. So you can have very small connections, but they might be really strong, and you don't feel lonely at all because you always feel like you have someone to turn to. But we do know that both are important. So loneliness impacts 1 in 3 older adults. Social isolation impacts 1 in 4 older adults. And actually, when we look at studies, even down to the level of the gene, isolation and loneliness have really big ramifications. So they've actually looked at how your genes respond and changes in what they call methylation of the genes. And it actually increases inflammation. So it upregulates inflammatory cytokines in your body when you're lonely, right? So it goes all the way down to this kind of biological effect. There have been a lot of studies that have looked at loneliness and its association with vascular health, so heart health. And there certainly is associated with heart disease, it's associated with stroke, and it's associated with mortality, and that's both related to cardiovascular health, but also just to all-cause mortality. And it may, again, be through these biological pathways, things like increasing isolation. So we know isolation and loneliness, 2 very important risk factors for health overall, also important for dementia. So in that Lancet Commission report I mentioned, they estimated that 2% of all dementia cases in the world are due to loneliness. So still a very important risk factor for things that are happening in the brain. And then finally, this is really interesting, I think. Hearing loss may actually impact the brain itself. So if it's untreated, it could result in brain changes such as loss of brain tissue over time. There have been a number of studies. So I don't know if anyone's had an MRI scan, a magnetic resonance imaging scan, where they put you in a machine and are able to actually look inside your brain and see what's happening over time. we can put participants into these scanners and understand what parts of the brain are working when they're doing different tasks. And poor hearing, I think not surprisingly, is associated with lower neural activity in the parts of brain that are supposed to be processing speech. This is maybe a little bit like the use it or lose it. If you're part of brain that's dedicated to processing speech, but you're no longer kind of giving it input, then maybe it would shrink over time. I think that's not so surprising. But I think what's really interesting is in those same individuals with hearing loss, you see other parts of the brain light up. And these are parts of the brain that are not active if someone has normal hearing. And they're the parts of the brain in the front, the prefrontal cortex. And that really is involved in problem solving, right? So it probably has to do again with that cognitive load. Your brain is trying really hard to figure out what's being said. So it's recruiting those problem solving parts of the brain to try to sort it out. And there have been some studies that have shown that hearing loss is associated with faster loss of brain tissue over time compared to people who have normal hearing. We know that there are important things to keep your brain healthy and certain pathologies that are related to brain disease. So cerebrovascular disease is important. So something like a stroke or what's called a TIA, a transient ischemic attack, or a very small stroke. Those can have important ramifications for our thoughts and dementia risk. Alzheimer's disease has its own pathology. So you've probably heard of the beta amyloid and the plaques and the tau tangles, right? So we know as we start accumulating amyloid in our brain over time, that can eventually lead to neuronal atrophy and lead to dementia. And we really think about hearing loss as being something on top of that. So hearing loss, in addition to these other pathologies that are occurring in the brain, may be really what starts to put you over the edge towards cognitive decline and dementia. So we call it an extra hit, kind of a third hit on the brain, because we know these pathologies are occurring. You know, unfortunately with amyloid, that starts occurring even in our 20s. So it's like, it starts early in terms of the amyloid deposition. But there are a lot of people who have amyloid who don't have dementia, right? So we think that if you have hearing loss on top of something like amyloid, that really may just be the additional hit that leads you down the path to cognitive decline and dementia. So we have these overall three kind of major pathways by which we think hearing loss can actually cause changes to our cognition and our thinking abilities. We don't know if this is true. These are still hypotheses, but this is what we think. And I think that leads us to then, you know, this very clear, important question. If there are these pathways by which hearing loss can cause dementia, and I have hearing loss, does that mean I'm going to get dementia? And this is a question that we hear a lot. And so here I'm going to put my epidemiology teacher hat on, because I think what we really don't do a very good job in talking to the public when we communicate our findings is really explaining what risk means. And I think we feel like we have an intuitive understanding. We're used to seeing things like, oh, it's a 30% chance of rain, right? But it's not a 30%. It doesn't rain 30% of that day or anything like that, right? It rains or it doesn't. It's 0 or it's 1. So when we start thinking about understanding risk and how risk might be increased for someone with hearing loss, we can maybe look at a figure like this. So the individuals who have hearing loss, the average risk is in the bar that is on the left. The individuals without hearing loss, their average risk is in the bar that's on the right. And you can see that bar is lower. And I will say, based on my reading of the literature and what I believe to be true, that I think hearing loss increases risk by about 50% for dementia. That's the number that I think. So I think the risk in people with hearing loss for dementia is about 50% higher compared to older adults who don't have dementia. The first thing to understand about risk is that does not mean that people who have normal hearing have 0 risk. That's not true. There are lots of other risk factors for dementia, right? We're just talking about the excess risk associated with hearing loss. So people without hearing loss have risk too, so that's important to keep in mind. So I hate to say it, but if you have perfect hearing, that does not mean you're not at risk for dementia or cognitive decline, right? We have to do other things too, like keep our heart healthy as well. Okay, so really is this excess risk, like over and above this background risk that we're talking about when we talk about that 50%? What does that really mean? So in an epidemiologic study, what we study is a population. And the way we interpret our findings is at the level of the population. On average, across everyone I studied, the risk of dementia associated with hearing loss was increased by 50%. Right? So we're looking at a group of people. And what becomes really difficult is when we want to say then, well, what does that mean for one individual person? An individual's risk is not 50%. They will either get the disease, that's 0, or I'm sorry, they will not get the disease, that's 0, or they will get the disease, that's 1. We just don't know where they fall. So when we're talking about 50%, right, that's really what we mean, a 50% increased risk. And I do think the weather is a good example of this, right? If we see a 30% chance of rain, what that means is on days like today, with conditions like today, 30 out of 100 times it rained, right? It's the same idea for an individual's risk. Hearing loss is a risk factor for dementia, but it does not mean that everyone who has hearing loss will get dementia. So that's just something important to keep in mind. We do have a number of public health studies, and I shared with you that Lancet Commission report that suggests hearing loss is related. And we have those pathways by which we think hearing loss may actually cause cognitive decline or dementia. But I do just want to emphasize, at this time, we don't know. We don't know if hearing loss is a true risk factor. And I know recently in the Wall Street Journal, I think most recently, there was a headline that says hearing aids protect against dementia. That's false. We don't know if that's true. We think it's true, but we don't yet know. So it's overstating kind of the study findings. We're working now to find out. So we're conducting, I mentioned the randomized clinical trial is one of the strongest types of studies that we have. We're currently conducting a study. We took people from 4 sites around the country and we randomized them to either receive a best practices hearing intervention that included hearing aids, but it also included a lot of counseling and rehabilitation treatment. And we're comparing that to individuals who got a health education control. And the exciting news is that our study is now wrapping up. We're finishing our data collection. Because this is a randomized trial, we have to be very careful about who has access to the data. There's one biostatistician who's going to be conducting the analysis, but we do expect results to come out this summer. So it will be the summer or fall at the latest that will actually have, I think, some evidence to suggest whether hearing loss might be associated. And I would be certainly happy to reach out once we have that information. Okay. What I will say is we do know that hearing loss impacts a lot of other things besides cognition. It impacts social engagement, it impacts quality of life, it impacts how well you're able to get out and engage in social functions, as well as cognitively stimulating functions as well. And so even if hearing loss does not impact cognition, it certainly does impact our health. So we do think it's important to think about treating it if hearing loss is present. If you have concerns about your hearing, what should you do? Well, usually hearing can be treated. It doesn't get us back to 100%. Hearing aids can help though. And especially if we add on those services, the rehabilitation, that can really be helpful because we can try to optimize our hearing and use strategies to help us hear as well as we can when we're in the settings where we have difficulty. And so I am not a clinician, I'm a PhD, not an MD, so I cannot give medical advice. But I would recommend that you talk with your doctor who can then give you a hearing test or recommend you to a specialist for hearing testing if you're concerned. I think just every bit is important. Well, what do I do? I'm very interested in preserving my memory and my cognition. What do I do about that? And anything that is good for your heart is also very good for your brain. And so there's a lot of strategies that we know actually do make a difference for helping with dementia and cognition, preventing high blood pressure. If you have high blood pressure, managing it, keeping it under control, managing blood sugar, diabetes, maintaining a healthy weight, being physically active. We really can't overstate the importance of movement. And it doesn't have to be strenuous. Wonderful, beautiful woman here running. You don't have to run to get good exercise. It can be walking, it can be gardening, just getting up and moving instead of staying very sedentary for long amounts of time. Any little bit can help. And we actually see that people who are up and moving around more often rather than having more times in kind of extended sedentary behavior, that alone is associated with better cognition. So everything helps. Smoking cessation, excessive drinking. Now, a little bit of drinking is good for us. And maybe that's because it also oftentimes includes social functions where we get together. So a little bit of drinking is good. It actually shows positive associations for cognition, but we want to avoid excessive drinking. Sleep is really important. We talked about amyloid. Actually, those amyloid plaques in your brain get cleared when you sleep. And so if you don't have enough sleep, you don't have enough time to get all the gunk out of your brain that can cause problems down the line. And then finally, exactly what you're doing here today. Participating in hopefully something that's at least a little bit cognitively stimulating, certainly a very social function. These types of things we know are very, very important for maintaining cognition and preventing dementia as we age. So finally, I think hopefully we're good on time. I think, yep, we look in good shape. I just want to end with a couple of slides. So as we think about getting older and as we age, what are the things that we really want to make sure that we can maintain? And most of the time, that's our function, right? We want to be able to be cognitively active. So the picture of the gentleman in the lower left here, he's doing a crossword. Not that crosswords are bad, but they're alone not the answer, right? We need to engage just in generally cognitively stimulating activities. And the truth is our brains like things that are new. So if you get out and walk, take a different route, go a different way. Like all of those sorts of things can stimulate the brain, can be very valuable. You know, we've got two people here in the middle engaging in some stretching, some physical activity. That's very important for us to maintain. And then of course, our social activity, our social engagement as well. Our brain is really important to make sure that we can engage in all of those types of activities. But our brain is encased in our skull. It can't actually interact with our environment. The way it interacts with our environment is through our senses. That includes hearing, but it includes other senses as well. And so we really think that sensory function is so important to help optimize. And by doing that, we allow our brain to get all of that information from our environment, and that allows us to engage in all these activities that we want to. So we really at the Cochlear Center believe hearing loss is fundamental to health and quality of life as we age, but we believe other senses are as well. And with that, I would just like to acknowledge my colleagues at the Cochlear Center. Dr. Franklin there is in the middle. I'm to the right, different hair color. I started during the pandemic a little bit more gray, and I decided I did not want to be graceful about it, so that's me. And then Nick Reed is pictured here as well, and so he's the audiologist that I mentioned. I shared some of his slides. So thank you so much. I really appreciate being here today.
Does anyone have any questions? Okay.
Thank you.
When you speak about treatment, is there any treatment other than hearing aids?
Thank you. So for the most part, for something like a mild to moderate loss, the primary treatment for hearing loss will be amplification through something like a hearing aid. But there are also devices that amplify sound that are not themselves hearing aids. And so you may have heard of something like that. They are called personal sound amplifiers or PSAPs. Those are something that you can get in the pharmacy. Like a hearing aid, they will be amplifying the sound. Something like that could be used as well. And some of the technology for those is really quite good. As we get into more severe hearing loss, then we're thinking more about something like a cochlear implant. But I do want to emphasize across the board, no matter kind of where you are, whether it's just a little amplification that's needed or something that's more intensive, there are a lot of different communication strategies and rehabilitation things that audiologists can do as well. And so, for example, in the clinical trial I mentioned, we had an entire session that was just devoted to understanding what people's hearing goals were. And then there are a lot of devices that you may be able to get that will pair with the hearing aid to help you meet that device or meet that goal. So for example, if your goal is to hear the television more, there are a lot of kind of devices that will then pair with the hearing aid that can help with that, for example. So there really is kind of a range of treatment. Primarily, I think everyone thinks hearing aids, but those services can be just as valuable in terms of communication strategies and that type of thing as well. Thank you.
Yeah. I'm very loud. It's not what your main specialty is. Touch a little bit on the genetics aspects of dementia. Your hearing loss is an issue, but how much does that play into it? So.
Yeah. Yes, thank you. So the question was if I could touch a little bit on the genetic aspects of dementia in addition to the hearing loss. So we do know there are some really important genetic predictors of hearing loss. The most common one is, and the strongest gene that predicts risk is something that's called apolipoprotein E4. And if you have two E4 alleles, that puts you at highest risk, but having one E4 allele puts you at increased risk as well. We do actually know from the studies that individuals who have increased genetic risk, so if it's a family history, for example, a lot of times dementia then starts to, it may influence risk of dementia, but only up to a certain age. By the time you get to be age 80 or older, it may not play as strong a role. We also know there are some very interesting differences by race with the genetic component. So African Americans are more likely to have genetic risk factors, but it's not quite as strong a risk factor in African Americans. So they're more likely to have E4 alleles, but less likely to have dementia risk due to that E4 allele. I'm not sure that we really understand why, except that on average in our country, African Americans tend to have greater vascular risk, and so that may be kind of outweighing the genetic contribution. So there certainly are genetic contributions to dementia, but it's not inevitable. So there are certainly people who have an E4 allele, for example, who never then go on to develop dementia. Yes.
There's the school public health outreach program that goes from infancy to the elderly.
So I'm sorry, the question is, does the School of Public Health have an outreach program that
Yes.
For older adults?
For infancy.
Oh, from infancy. Yes, so the question is, does the School of Public Health have a program that goes from children into adults to be able to conduct hearing testing? Unfortunately, the answer is no, that we don't, that's not something that we do generally speaking. We do have a number of studies that are currently ongoing, and some of those studies are designed really to bring hearing healthcare to underserved populations. So we have some studies that are really focused on not providing hearing aids, but providing some of those sound amplifiers to underserved people who are living in Baltimore City, for example. But unfortunately, at this time, we don't have anything that's more broadly scoping than that. So it's within research. Yes, thank you. Yes.
I have a rather long comment.
Would you like the mic?
I'm a perfect model for speaker because I had severe hearing loss. I have 2 sets of hearing aids that don't work well.
Yeah.
Masks are made it very difficult. because we can't see spaces. But my comment is, I really appreciate the problem that we have taxing the brain to understand what's going on. I know it's effective because I have to struggle to understand, and I often don't. And that is something I'm not sure we can do anything about that. That's one of the biggest problems that I have.
You were saying that the best way to prevent dementia is dealing with it in middle age. Is there any outreach you're doing to alert?
So the question is about kind of where do we prioritize risk reduction for dementia, middle age versus later life? There have been some studies that have been done that particularly show even in late life, we can make a difference if we target more than one factor. So I think in midlife, a lot of the studies that kind of led people to have that mindset, and this mindset, I still, it's about 20 years old now, was really thinking like only hypertension or only diabetes that we should be addressing. And I think we've learned more in those 20 years that actually if we target multiple factors, so that kind of list that we shared, if you're trying to maximize that as much as possible, then that can help prevent dementia risk. So, the work that I do is primarily in research rather than advocacy and outreach, but certainly that is, there are other organizations like the Alzheimer's Association. If you would go to the Center for Disease Control, for example, they have those same sorts of things listed out. And I think the main message is really try to think about as many of them as you can when you're thinking about your cognition, because the more that you're able to address, I think that the better result.
My question is about cognitive load as well, and certainly if you're hard of hearing, you have a difficulty when you're trying to process speech. But my question is, in the moderate to severe hearing loss, if you're quiescent, not trying to listen to speech, isn't there a reduced stimulation of the brain because you're not picking up any of the background noises in this room? You aren't hearing a rumbling of a tablecloth, you're not hearing birds outside or any of those simple things. Is the brain more quiescent in that situation? Sorry, I'm going back to the
I think that's an absolutely outstanding question. Thank you. So, the question is in terms of cognitive load, that cognitive load certainly is something that would be happening if you're picking up some of those sounds, but if you're not picking up any sounds, then what's kind of happening to the brain? And that's kind of that other mechanism that we think may be going on, those kind of direct changes to the brain. And I mentioned those studies, and it actually, you do see that happen. And it's seen pretty consistently that that part of the brain that's responsible for processing speech and sound shrinks in people who have hearing loss. So we do see that's true. I think the bigger question is whether or not that impacts the brain more broadly. And I think that's something that we don't really know. But there's some, I'd say, a small number of studies, so not a lot of studies, but some studies that suggest that it may actually move beyond just that one area and actually impact the brain overall. Fantastic question. Thank you. Thank you.
I think I understood you to make a distinction between hearing aids and amplification devices. Have you heard that? Can you tell us what the distinction is?
Yeah. So the question was about hearing aids versus amplification devices. And the truth is sometimes there are big differences and sometimes there are no differences at all. It's just on who's licensed to sell them. So there's a long history in this country of being able to, being required to sell a hearing aid, to be licensed to sell that hearing aid. And it has to do with at the time when that law was passed, hearing aids actually could do damage to your ears. The technology has come really far now, but there are really only 5 big hearing aid companies around the world. They have a number of different offshoots, but really only 5 big hearing aid companies. You may have heard of something that went into effect recently that's called the Over-the-Counter Hearing Aid Act. And this is legislation that went into effect before the pandemic. It required the FDA to kind of decide what would be essentially the legislation around regulation of what would be called a hearing aid device versus a sound amplification device. Those regulations came out over the summer, and we're now in the part, like now at the stage where companies can sell hearing aids just in a pharmacy, or they don't necessarily have to go through an audiologist or a hearing aid dispenser. So we are now at that stage, but I'd say we're still very early in understanding how that will impact. The goal with that legislation, and Dr. Lynn and Dr. Reed, who I work closely with, were instrumental in getting that legislation passed. The goal was to say, look, right now, the way that hearing aids are sold, it's through an audiologist or a hearing aid dispenser, but the services are bundled with the device. So the device can be $3,000, $4,000 or more to get a set of hearing aids. And the reason is because you're purchasing the ability to go back in and have it, checked, refit. If you lose it, there's a guarantee. So you are paying for the services at the same time you are paying for the device, which is why it's so expensive. The goal behind the Over-the-Counter Hearing Aid Act was to allow people who had the technology to sell hearing aids in a way that would hopefully be more affordable, less money because you're not bundling with the services, and more accessible because now you don't have to go to an audiologist and see them 5 or 6 times to get a hearing aid. Now you have to get medical clearance, which means you need to see an ENT. So there are a number of different, sorry, I keep doing that. There are a number of different requirements to be able to get actually hearing aids through our healthcare system at this time. So the short answer is sometimes there's no difference. It's just whether or not you're licensed to sell a hearing aid.
I think we have time for 2 more questions. 2 more questions.
Yeah. Yeah.
Is the brain terminal? The other question here. For people who are born deaf.
Yeah.
I mean, if in fact it is believed.
Thank you for both of those questions. Really excellent questions, both of them. So tinnitus is that kind of ringing or buzzing in the ear. I don't know that we know the association with tinnitus and cognition. Tinnitus actually is something that is caused. It certainly is related to hearing, but it's actually caused by the brain. So when there are issues with hearing, it's that your brain is trying to make sense of what's happening. And so it is something that we know really strongly impacts quality of life. We also know it's associated with other stress responses, but I don't know that we have good enough population level data. I'm not aware of any studies looking at tinnitus and cognition. Your second question then, so the first was tinnitus, the second question was about people who are born deaf. Thank you so much for that question, because it gives me the opportunity to clarify. A lot of the mechanisms that I talked about here really are for us as we age, so it'd be more related to an age-related hearing loss. And that's because something like social isolation and loneliness may not exist for someone who's born deaf. So children may be treated early with a cochlear implant, so there may be engagement that way. The deaf community is a very, very strong, vibrant community. And so there's a lot of engagement and sense of identity and things that are all very helpful there. So I don't think we know. I think that's an important question across the life course as we age. And when hearing loss develops, does that make a difference for our cognition over time? And unfortunately, I just don't think we have the data to know that in studies. Excellent questions. Thank you. On the chat. Okay, let's see. Oh, so there's a question about COVID-related hearing loss. So that's something, I'm sorry I'm not able to answer that question, but so the question is, I lost my hearing in 2020 after having COVID. Why did that happen? I do know there are some studies that are looking at that now, and they're actually seeing some links that may be real. I'm sorry, I don't have enough information on that, but I'm happy to talk to colleagues who may be able to better answer that question. And then there's a question, if clarity is the issue with hearing loss and not loudness, why are the devices amplifiers? And that's a great question. I will say that hearing aids actually are quite sophisticated, and they can actually be fit to tune into certain frequencies that are lost based really on the audiogram. And so it is amplifying the sound that is too quiet to hear, but it amplifies only kind of in those areas that need to be amplified. And so it really is quite sophisticated in the way it can deal with an individual's hearing loss rather than broadly amplifying.
Would you please join me in thanking our speaker? First, in person, I so appreciate seeing you. We have up here, the membership committee has up here on the stage stuff.